I've been working on creating the GCBR index. So I'll jump right into it. I won't bore you with the structure. And so the main aim of this project was to estimate each country's contribution to global catastrophic biological risk, um, which is, I mean, quite a mean feat. And I don't think we're kind of exactly there yet, but I think we're along the way. And so more specifically, I'd say the index we have currently attempts to rank each country's relative risk of a spillover event, either from like a lab or zoonotic event. And so importantly, it focuses mainly on preventing spillovers, like trying to monitor the risk of a spillover event, rather than a country's ability to contain those spillover events. And it also doesn't yet account for any bioweapons risks. And so those could be like state actors or non-state actors. And that's purely because I'm just still in the process of building the bioweapons risk index. And so at the moment, it just looks like this. So the GCBR index is fed into by two sub-indexes, which is the zoonotic risk index and the laboratory risk index. Ooh. And so when I first kind of started proposing this idea to a few people and chatting people, the main pushback I got was, it's a good idea, but someone's actually already beaten you to the punch. The Global Health Security Index was created by the Nuclear Threat Initiative and Economist Impact, and it's this incredible resource that ranks every country's biosecurity policy around the world. And it's seemingly a really good measure of biosecurity policy. But where I'd like to push back is I don't think it's a good measure of biosecurity risk. And that's because risk comes from inherent risk factors as well as just the strength of a country's policy. And so I'll just run you through a quick kind of case study that I've cherry-picked here to pick on the US. So according to the Global Health Security Index, the US has the best biosecurity and biosafety policy in the world. And so if you're a policymaker in the US, you're pretty chuffed with your efforts because you've scored 90 and 100 in both of those tests, which is much higher than anything I've ever got. But they also have the most BSL-4 labs and the largest spending on gain-of-function-like research. And so when I estimated their kind of inherent risk scores, it was actually, even once I'd mitigated the effects of their policy, it still had the highest risk score out of any country I measured. And so the important takeaway here is effective policy reform must mitigate for the risk that is inherent to that country. And kind of prove to you that I didn't just cherry pick an example. This is the whole data set. And so on the y-axis is the Global Health Security's kind of policy scores for each country. And then on the x-axis is my inherent risk score for laboratory risks. And you can see that there is like somewhat of a correlation. And so this means as biosecurity kind of confidence is increasing, so is their inherent risk of producing a lab leak. And so this just proves that kind of the strength of a country's policy isn't necessarily a good measure of its risk. And so the way I've approached making these indexes is I've created, for each index, I've created an inherent risk score with a set of indices. And then I've also ranked the risk mitigation score, which is the strength of that country's policy. And so I'll just briefly show you what this is the laboratory leak index looks like. And so in the inherent risk score, I have indices that are measuring kind of the number of BSL-4 and 3 labs, the square footage of those labs, and the general research investment in gain-of-function-like research. And then I also score each country's policy with a variety of metrics for biosecurity and biosafety. Like, do they vet people who are working in these high security labs, and how safe is the transport of this material? And so Now I thought I'd just show you some pretty looking graphs that I've managed to generate from these indices. And so this is the laboratory risk index. You can see America's up in the naughty corner, but also India and China contribute a surprising amount, as well as coming to you from Australia, and we've got a fair bit of risk export coming out of here as well. And then on zoonotic risk, China and India contribute the vast amount. Bangladesh is huge. But you can also see there's a kind of dark tinge of red along the kind of equator, which I thought was really interesting that it picked that up. And then this is just the combined score of both of them. And here's kind of my naughty list of all the countries. You can see United Kingdom, you folks make it to 6th place. So, and so I thought just before I kind of jumped on, I added this section just to help us kind of have a look at like what do high risk export countries actually tend to look like. And so I apologize for these graphs; they're pretty atrocious, but they kind of tell the story anyway. And so on the y-axis is the laboratory and zoonotic index, and then here on the x-axis is population. And so you can see high-risk countries do tend to just be large in populace, but they don't actually tend to be dense, or like they're not necessarily dense. So there's no correlation there. And also, this surprised me. They're not necessarily wealthy either, or poor. There seems to be no correlation with wealth as measured by GDP per capita. And so if you're kind of curious, we've actually just launched a website with all this data on it. It's still fairly primitive and not that user-friendly, but you can search us up at gcbrindex.org and you can play around. You can see the data feeding into each indices and then the total risk scores as well. And so when I started out this project, I wanted to help policymakers find areas where policy doesn't effectively mitigate the inherent biological risk, and to help them find those policy areas and mitigate kind of inherent risks. But I also hope to find funders and NGOs to effectively allocate resources towards mitigating biological threats. And I don't think I'm like quite there yet, but it's getting close to something that makes sense. And so, yeah, I'd just like to wrap up by saying a huge thank you to my mentor, Gregory Lewis, and my incredible research manager, Oscar Delaney. Both of you have been incredibly tolerant of my disorganization. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all the advisors who have come on and advised me on which indices to use in different areas. Thanks to the huge ERA team, it's been awesome. The fellows, you guys are great. And thank you everyone who's come to watch